The morning light in Sunnyvale, California, during the 1950s was soft and golden. It filtered through the leaves of apricot and cherry trees that line the quiet streets of the Santa Clara Valley. Before the world knew it as Silicon Valley, this was an orchard-dotted landscape where families lived in modest ranch homes and children rode bicycles along pavement still warm from the afternoon sun. In one such home, a boy named Steve Wozniak was born in 1950, and it was here that a gentle, curious spirit began to unfold. The hum of bees and the distant sound of a lawnmower would eventually share space with the quiet clicking of wires and the smell of solder. But for now, it was simply a place of peace. The house sat low and wide, with a eucalyptus tree casting dappled shade across the front yard. Inside, the atmosphere was one of calm encouragement, where questions were never turned away and a child's fascination could take root. Stephen's father, Jerry, worked as an engineer at Lockheed. He would come home in the evenings and share the world of electronics with his young son. In the warm glow of a living room lamp, the two would sit with a breadboard and components, connecting resistors and capacitors just to see what would happen. The father spoke in a low, patient voice, explaining the flow of electricity in a way that felt like storytelling. The boy listened, not always understanding, but always feeling safe in the circle of light that held them both. Those evenings planted something deep inside him. The house was never loud, never hurried. The radio played distant jazz or the murmur of a baseball game. Outside, the sky would fade from orange to violet, and the first stars would blink through the branches. It was a life built on small discoveries, and every night ended with the gentle click of a lamp switch and the rustling of sheets as a boy dreamed in circuits. As Stephen grew, his fascination turned into something more tangible. He collected transistors like other children collected stamps. He would carefully unwrap each one, handling it as if it were a jewel. His bedroom became a quiet sanctuary of parts and possibilities. On his desk, a simple soldering iron sat next to a spool of silver wire, and the window looked out onto a backyard where daisies grew along the fence. The light that came through that window was often the late afternoon kind, honey-colored, tracing long rectangles on the floor. There was no pressure to perform, no looming deadline, just the pure pleasure of making things work. He built a crystal radio and pressed the earpiece close, hearing faint voices that seemed like magic. The world was revealing itself to him not in explosions, but in quiet hums and gentle beeps. Each evening, his mother would call him to supper, and he would leave his parts in orderly rows, ready for the next day's quiet exploration. School for Stephen was a place of bright classrooms and long hallways. At Homestead High, the California sun streamed through large windows and fell upon linoleum floors polished to a soft shine. He was a shy boy, more comfortable with a slide rule than with crowds. During lunch breaks, he would sometimes find a bench under an oak tree and read about computer logic. The architecture of the school was typical of the time, low brick buildings that seemed to hug the earth. The scent of freshly cut grass drifted from the athletic fields, and the distant sound of a tennis ball plucked a gentle rhythm. It was here that Stephen first felt the difference between knowing how to use something and understanding why it worked. His electronics teacher, Mr. McCullum, recognized the quiet genius and gave him access to the school's small lab, a room of dark shelves and glowing vacuum tubes. In that room, Wozniak would spend hours, the clock ticking softly above the door. The outside world, with its traffic and chatter, faded into a hush. He was building a foundation, one careful step at a time. Summers in the valley were long and warm, the air smelling of dry grass and the sweet tang of ripening fruit. Stephen found a job washing dishes at a local restaurant, but his mind never left the world of electronics. In the evenings, he would ride his bicycle along the tree-lined streets, the sky turning peach and rose. The bicycle chain made a soft clicking sound, a metronome for his thoughts. He passed homes where porch lights were just beginning to glow, and families sat outside, enjoying the cool evening air. These rides were a form of meditation, a way to let his mind wander freely over problems of logic and design. The Santa Clara Valley was still a place of gentle beauty then, with farmland rolling toward the foothills. He felt no rush to conquer anything. He was simply a young man watching the world light up, one street lamp at a time. Back home, he would sit on the porch and sketch circuit diagrams on scrap paper, the pencil scratching softly in the twilight. His mother would bring him a glass of lemonade, and they would sit together without speaking, just listening to the crickets. One of the things that shaped young Stephen was his love for pranks, but these were never cruel or loud. They were the quiet, clever kind born of a mind that saw patterns where others did not. He once built a small electronic device that could emit a high-pitched tone, and he brought it to the school library. As students tried to read in the silence, the faint, almost imperceptible sound would make them look around with puzzled expressions. There was no malice in it, only the gentle joy of watching people try to solve a mystery. The library itself was a peaceful brick building with ivy climbing one wall, the kind of place where dust motes danced in sunbeams. The heavy wooden tables and the smell of old paper gave it a timeless quality. His prank was a quiet ripple in that calm, and it made him smile to see the librarian tilt her head in confusion. It was the same mind that would later craft beautiful, efficient computer designs, always seeking the simplest, most elegant solution, the one that made people wonder why it hadn't been done that way before. Eventually, the boy who loved circuits grew into a young man who still looked at the world with wonder. He went off to college, first to the University of Colorado and then back home to De Anza College and UC Berkeley. The campuses were filled with eucalyptus trees and open quads where students lay on the grass between classes. The architecture of Sproul Plaza at Berkeley had a classic dignity, stone steps leading up to buildings where knowledge was passed on in quiet lecture halls. Stephen would sit in those halls with a notebook, not furiously taking dictation, but slowly sketching out ideas in the margins. The slide of chalk on blackboard, the rustle of turning pages, the late autumn light slanting through high windows, all of it seeped into his way of being. He was in no hurry to become anything. The world of technology was beginning to hum with new energy. The first microprocessors were appearing, and a quiet revolution was stirring in garages and basements. But Stephen Wozniak moved through it all as if walking along a shaded path, aware that the truest things grow slowly, and that the best designs come not from ambition, but from love. The story of how Steve Wozniak met Steve Jobs has been told many times, but it is best imagined as a quiet intersection of two different minds in the early 1970s. The setting was a familiar one, a friend's garage in the suburban sprawl of Cupertino. The garage door stood open to let in the afternoon breeze, and the scent of dry leaves mixed with the faint odor of motor oil. Wozniak, already a college student with a deep knowledge of electronics, was introduced to a wiry, intense young man named Jobs, who was still in high school but carried himself with a quiet certainty. The two stood among garden tools and cardboard boxes, the concrete floor cool underfoot. Sunlight angled through dusty windows, catching motes of dust suspended in the air. It was not a dramatic meeting, no bolts of lightning or loud proclamations, just two people who recognized something in each other. Outside, a dog barked lazily in a neighboring yard, and the distant sound of a lawnmower hummed a steady note. What drew Wozniak to Jobs was not a shared skill in electronics, for Jobs was not an engineer, but a shared sense of possibility. They both loved music, especially Bob Dylan, and they spent long afternoons listening to records in the dim light of a living room. The turntable needle would settle into the groove, and the harmonica and guitar would fill the space. Wozniak would close his eyes and let the music wash over him, while Jobs would talk about ideas, about changing the world. These were not grand speeches, but soft conversations between songs. The room would grow dark as evening came on, the only light coming from the orange glow of a stereo receiver. The walls held posters of musicians, the corners were draped in shadows. It was a time of unhurried youth, when friendship grew through shared silence as much as shared words. In these moments, the idea of building something together was not yet formed, but the trust was there, settling like dust on the furniture. The first real collaboration between the two friends came from an article in a magazine. Wozniak read about something called a blue box, a device that could generate the precise tones used by telephone networks to place free long-distance calls. The idea fascinated him, not because he wanted to steal, but because it was a puzzle of frequencies and circuits. He stayed up late one night, his soldering iron glowing orange in the dark, and built a simple version of it. The quiet house around him slept, the only sound the soft hiss of the iron and the occasional creak of the floor settling. By morning, he had a working device, a little box that could sing the phone company's secret song. He showed it to Jobs, and Jobs's eyes lit up with the possibilities. They decided to make these boxes and sell them to fellow students. It was a playful venture, a prank elevated to an art form. They drove through the Berkeley Hills at dusk, the city lights flickering below, and stopped in dormitory lounges where young people gathered around out of curiosity. The blue box sat on coffee tables under the soft light of floor lamps, and Wozniak would demonstrate it with a quiet smile, tapping the keys and asking for a connection to the Vatican. The whole scene had the feel of a magic trick, a gentle illusion shared among friends. Selling the blue boxes taught Wozniak something about himself and about Jobs. They would stand on the steps of student housing units, the concrete still warm from the sun, and talk in low voices. Jobs handled the sales, his voice calm but persuasive, while Wozniak stood back and watched, content to be the one who had made the thing work. The California sky above them was often a deep blue, streaked with clouds that caught the last pink of sunset. The air smelled of jasmine, and the sound of a distant guitar floated from an open window. It was not a business in any formal sense, just a small, secret enterprise that brought them a little money and a lot of joy. They were young, and the world was full of such harmless adventures. There was no talk of corporations or stock offerings, no visions of a digital future. There were only these evenings, these conversations, and the quiet satisfaction of a clever circuit that did what it was supposed to do. Wozniak's own life during this time was a balance of study and experimentation. He was a student at UC Berkeley, walking through the campus with a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. The bell tower, known as the Campanile, rose above the eucalyptus trees, its chimes marking the hours. He would find a spot on the grass near the library and open a book, but his mind often drifted to new designs. The architecture of the campus, with its Beaux-Arts buildings and shaded pathways, had a soothing regularity. He would watch the sunlight play on the facade of Wheeler Hall, the shadows of branches dancing in the breeze. It was in this atmosphere of calm inquiry that he first heard about the new Intel 8080 microprocessor. He studied the specifications as if reading poetry, marveling at its potential. Yet he could not afford to buy one, so he started designing his own computer using a cheaper processor, the MS Technology 6502. He did this not to start a company, but simply because he wanted a computer of his own, a machine that could run BASIC and do his bidding. The work was its own reward, a quiet obsession that kept him up late, the only light in his small apartment coming from the green glow of an oscilloscope screen. At night, when the campus grew quiet and the last students had gone home, Wozniak would sometimes walk alone along the paths. The lamplight spilled in pools on the pavement, and the ivy rustled softly against the walls. He thought about keyboards and memory chips, about how to make a machine that was both powerful and simple. The design took shape in his mind like a landscape coming into view through morning mist. He carried a small notebook in his back pocket, its pages filled with tidy schematics drawn in pencil. The stars overhead were faint, washed out by the lights of the city, but still present for anyone who cared to look up. He often looked up, feeling the immensity of the sky and the smallness of his own work, yet also feeling that his work was part of something bigger, a thread in the fabric of human creativity. These nocturnal walks were his meditation, a way to let the circuits in his mind settle into place. The night air was cool and carried the scent of pine, and far off, the Bay Bridge was a string of pearls against the dark water. He went home and slept deeply, dreaming in ones and zeros. In a small hall in Menlo Park, not far from the freeway, a group of people began to gather on Wednesday evenings. The building was unassuming, a low structure with a flat roof and a sign that read Community Room. The year was 1975, and the air outside was cool, carrying the salt of the bay. Inside, folding chairs were arranged in rows, and a simple podium stood at the front. This was the Homebrew Computer Club, a gathering of hobbyists, engineers, and dreamers who shared a passion for building their own computers. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, and the scent of coffee drifted from a table at the back. People arrived carrying boxes of parts, schematics rolled under their arms, and a sense of quiet excitement. They greeted each other with nods and warm handshakes, their conversations a low murmur of technical language. The mood was not of competition but of shared discovery, a community coming together under the pale yellow glow of institutional lighting. Steve Wozniak attended his first meeting with a friend, and he immediately felt at home. He sat in one of the metal chairs, its legs scraping slightly on the linoleum floor, and listened as people demonstrated their projects. One person had built a machine that could blink lights in a pattern. Another showed a terminal connected to a distant mainframe. Wozniak watched it all with his calm, attentive eyes. He didn't speak much that first evening. He absorbed the atmosphere, the sound of oscillators, and the smell of warm electronics. The walls of the room were bare, painted a pale beige, and on them the shadows of the attendees moved like silent ghosts. Outside, the night had fully fallen, and the windows reflected the interior seen back at itself. The parking lot was quiet, the cars sitting in neat rows under the orange glow of street lamps. It was in this humble setting that the personal computer revolution began to take shape, not with a bang, but with the gentle hum of conversation and the clicking of toggle switches. After that first meeting, Wozniak's mind was ignited. He went home to his apartment and sat before a workbench cluttered with chips and wires. The light above him was a simple desk lamp, its shade tilted low to focus on the task. He began drafting what would become the Apple I. The design came naturally to him, as if the machine had always existed and he was simply uncovering it. He drew the schematic on a large sheet of graph paper, his pencil moving in careful, deliberate strokes. The apartment was quiet except for the occasional rustle of paper. A window was open a crack, letting in the cool night air and the distant murmur of traffic. He would take breaks to make a cup of tea, standing in the tiny kitchen and looking out at the darkness, then return to the workbench with renewed focus. It was a solitary, peaceful endeavor. He was not racing against anyone, he was simply doing what he loved. By the time the first hint of dawn appeared above the hills, he had the basic layout complete. The rising sun painted the room in soft pinks and golds, and he sat back, satisfied, not yet knowing that this quiet night's work would change everything. The Homebrew Club provided feedback and encouragement. At the next meeting, Wozniak brought his schematic and spread it out on a table near the back. A small crowd gathered, peering down at the neat lines and symbols. They asked questions in respectful tones, and Wozniak answered each one, his voice low and patient. The scene had the quality of a study group in a library, people leaning in, pointing gently, nodding in understanding. The air was warm with the closeness of bodies, and someone opened a window to let in the fresh evening breeze. The room, for all its plainness, felt like a sanctuary. Here, no idea was too strange, no dream too ambitious. The club members were a diverse group, an older man who had worked on mainframes in the 1960s, a teenager who had taught himself programming, a woman who was designing her own interface board. All of them shared a belief that computers should belong to individuals, not just corporations. This belief was a quiet fire in their eyes, something you could see when they spoke about the future. Between meetings, Wozniak continued refining his design. He wanted his computer to be simple enough for anyone to build, yet powerful enough to run a high-level language. He chose the MS6502 microprocessor because it was affordable and elegant in its instruction set. He added a keyboard interface and a way to connect a monitor. Every component was chosen with care, as if selecting stones for a garden path. He would visit electronic surplus stores on quiet afternoons, the bell on the door jingling as he entered. Inside, the shelves were crammed with mysterious boxes and bins, and the air had a metallic tang. The proprietor, often an older man with a kindly face, would chat with him about the weather while he sifted through parts. Sunlight streamed through the dusty front window, illuminating the worn wooden floor. It was a slow, pleasant ritual, this hunting for components. He would leave with a small paper bag, its contents clinking softly, and walk back to his car. The streets were lined with palm trees, their fronds rustling in the wind, and the sky was a clear, untroubled blue. At the next club meeting, Wozniak stood up to give a short demonstration. He had built a prototype on a slab of plywood, and he connected it to a small black-and-white television. The screen flickered to life, showing a few lines of basic code. The audience leaned forward. There was no applause at first, just a collective intake of breath. Then, a slow smile spread through the room. They understood what they were seeing, a real, working computer that a person could build themselves. Wozniak stood by his creation, looking almost shy. The fluorescent light seemed less harsh now, softened by the wonder in the air. Outside, the night was still and the stars were faint. Inside, the future was being born in a humble hall, a future of quiet clicks and glowing screens, of information shared freely and gently. And at the center of it all was a soft-spoken engineer who just wanted to build something beautiful and share it with his friends. It was the purest expression of the homebrew spirit, a gift given without expectation, wrapped in wires and solder and love. The garage on Chris Drive in Los Altos has become a symbol of Silicon Valley's humble beginnings. In 1976, it was simply a place where a family parked their cars, the walls lined with tools and boxes. The door would open each morning to the quiet suburban street, letting in the cool air that carried the scent of dew on grass. Steve Jobs' parents owned the house, and they allowed these two young men, Steve and Steve, to use the space for their work. Wozniak would arrive in the early afternoon, the sun high and warm. He parked his car under a magnolia tree that was just beginning to bloom, its white petals scattered on the pavement like soft confetti. The neighborhood was peaceful, the only sounds the occasional bark of a dog or the distant laughter of children playing. There was no sign, no corporate logo, just a house like any other, with a swing set in the backyard and a garden hose coiled beside the porch. But inside that garage, something new was taking shape, something that would touch the lives of millions. The garage itself was a modest rectangle of concrete and wood. The floor was unpainted and slightly dusty, catching the afternoon light in long stripes that fell through the slats of the open door. In one corner sat a workbench that Wozniak had set up. On it rested a soldering iron, spools of wire, and the prototype of a circuit board. The board was about the size of a notebook, its green surface traced with thin copper lines. To Wozniak, it was a thing of beauty, a perfectly ordered landscape of logic and flow. He would stand there for hours, the hum of a small fan keeping him cool as he worked. Jobs would come and go, sometimes bringing a cold bottle of soda from the house, the glass sweating in the heat. They talked in low voices about what this machine could become. The air smelled of flux and heated metal, but beneath that was the earthier scent of the garage itself, old wood and stored memories. Overhead, a bare bulb hung from a cord, providing a steady pool of light when the sun began to set. Building the Apple I was a delicate process, but for Wozniak it felt as natural as breathing. He would place a chip into the board, its tiny silver legs finding their sockets perfectly. He believed in doing things right the first time, not because of haste, but because his mind saw the whole design at once, complete and harmonious. Each component had its place, and together they formed a silent symphony. He worked with a gentle precision, holding the solder wire like a conductor's baton. The smoke would rise in thin wisps, curling up toward the rafters where old spiderwebs caught the light. Outside, the afternoon would mellow into evening, the shadows lengthening across the driveway. Wozniak's back would ache after a while, and he would stretch, stepping out into the yard to breathe the fresh air. The grass was green and neatly trimmed, the flower beds planted with marigolds. He would look up at the sky, where the first star of evening appeared like a single pixel of light, and feel a quiet gratitude. This was his life, and he could not imagine a better one. The machine came together over several months. Wozniak tested each function, tapping keys on a homemade keyboard and watching the characters appear on a small monitor. The screen glowed with a soft green phosphorescence, and in that glow his face was illuminated with a boyish wonder. There was no operating system as we know it today, only a monitor program that waited patiently for instructions. But it worked. It could run BASIC, the language that made computing accessible to ordinary people. Wozniak typed a short program, and the screen obediently printed, "Hello." It was a quiet moment, no cheering, no champagne, just a smile and a long exhale. Jobs, who had been watching, nodded and then began talking about selling them. The conversation shifted from engineering to commerce, and Wozniak listened, still looking at his creation. The garage seemed now to hold a sacred space, a little altar of innovation. The light bulb above flickered slightly, as if in acknowledgement. Selling the Apple I meant taking the board to the Byte shop, a small computer store in Mountain View. The shop was a narrow room with shelves of electronics and a glass counter at the front. The owner, Paul Terrell, was a kindly man with a gentle voice. He looked at the bare board that Wozniak and Jobs presented, and instead of dismissing it, he saw potential. He agreed to buy 50 assembled units. The afternoon light filtered through the store window, casting a warm pattern on the wooden floor. Wozniak stood quietly, letting Jobs handle the negotiation. The smell of new plastic and old solder filled the air. Outside, cars passed slowly on the quiet street, their engines a soft drone. This was the first real transaction of what would become Apple Computer. It was a deal sealed not with grand ambition, but with a handshake and a shared understanding. The two friends walked out into the sunshine, the world unchanged yet somehow different. The whole of Silicon Valley was still mostly orchards and low buildings, a gentle landscape on the cusp of transformation. Back in the garage, the work took on a new pace. 50 computers meant 50 boards to assemble, test, and package. Wozniak's friends and family pitched in, sitting around a picnic table in the backyard on weekends. The scene was a gentle one, people chatting, tools passing back and forth, the occasional laughter. The picnic table was shaded by a large oak tree, and the dappled light played across the circuit boards. Children ran barefoot on the grass, and someone had set a pitcher of lemonade on the porch railing. It felt less like a factory and more like a family gathering. Wozniak moved among the helpers, showing them how to straighten the pins on a chip or how to avoid cold solder joints. His voice was ever patient, his smile ever ready. The California sky was a deep, cloudless blue, and the smell of barbecue drifted from a neighbor's yard. It was a time of innocent industry, a brief moment when making a computer felt as natural as canning fruit or building a birdhouse. The Apple I was not a product of stress, but of love, born in a place where the light was warm and the rhythm of work was gentle. While the Apple I was a milestone, it was the Apple II that truly opened the door to personal computing. Wozniak's vision for this machine was grander, yet it came from the same quiet, methodical heart. He wanted a computer that could display color graphics, that could connect to a television and speak in vibrant hues. The design took shape in the same Los Altos garage, but the scope was larger. He began by thinking about how to generate a color signal cheaply and elegantly. The solution came to him not in a flash, but as a gradual dawning, like the morning sun illuminating a room piece by piece. He realized he could use a single chip to produce color by exploiting the way televisions interpret signals. It was a hack of pure beauty, so economical that it would be patented decades later as a stroke of brilliance. He sketched the timing diagrams on a napkin at a local diner, the paper napkin absorbing the ink of his pen while the scent of coffee and pancakes filled the air. The diner window overlooked a quiet street where cars glided by, and the whole scene was bathed in the soft light of a coastal morning. He sipped his coffee and smiled, feeling that same deep satisfaction that came from finding a simple solution to a complex problem. Building the prototype of the Apple II was a longer journey than the Apple I. Wozniak would drive from his home to the garage, the freeway a ribbon of asphalt cutting through hills that were golden in the summer and green in the winter. He often drove in the late morning, when the traffic was light and the sun was gentle on the windshield. The dashboard of his car held a scattering of papers and manuals, and the radio played soft rock at a low volume. Arriving at the garage, he would open the door and let the fresh air flow through. The space now looked more like a small laboratory, with oscilloscopes and logic analyzers sharing table space with cups of cold coffee. Yet the mood remained unhurried. Wozniak worked in a state of deep concentration, but it was the concentration of a painter before a canvas, not a soldier in battle. He would pause to eat an apple, standing in the doorway and watching the clouds drift. The world was still a quiet place, despite the complex circuits taking form under his hands. The heart of the Apple II was its plastic case, a molded beige shell that gave it the look of a friendly appliance. This was a departure from the bare boards of hobbyist machines. The case was smooth to the touch, with slits for cooling that created a subtle pattern of light and shadow when the machine was turned on. Inside, the logic board was a masterpiece of neatness, every trace laid down with the care of a watchmaker. Wozniak's design was so efficient that the Apple II had only 62 chips on its main board, far fewer than comparable machines. This simplicity meant it was reliable and affordable. He would sit with the open case beside him, running diagnostic programs while the screen displayed intricate patterns of color. The soft glow of the CRT monitor filled the dim garage with a gentle light, painting Wozniak's face in shifting tones of amber and violet. The sound of the keys clicking was rhythmic, almost musical. He felt at peace, knowing that this machine was exactly what he had hoped it would be, a tool for creativity, a canvas for the mind. One of the features that made the Apple II special was its expansion slots. Wozniak insisted on including 8 of them, so that users could add their own hardware cards. This openness was an expression of his belief that the computer should be a platform for others to build upon. He wanted it to be like a friendly town square, where people could set up their own booths and share ideas. The slots were lined up on the board like quiet streets, each waiting to be populated. In the evenings, he would test them with prototype cards, plugging them in and feeling the satisfying click of the connector. The garage would be quiet except for the soft whir of a cooling fan. Outside, the neighborhood was settling into the night. Lights came on in the windows of houses up the street, warm yellow squares against the darkening blue. He would sometimes walk over to Jobs' house and sit on the back porch, talking about what the Apple II could become. The conversation flowed easily, 2 friends sharing a dream under the stars. The scent of night-blooming jasmine was thick in the air, and the fabric of their future was being woven in words so soft they could have been a lullaby. The Apple II was introduced to the public at the West Coast Computer Fair in April 1977. The event was held in a large convention hall in San Francisco, a cavernous space filled with colorful booths and glowing screens. Wozniak stood at the Apple booth, his hands gently resting on the beige machine. The hum of conversation and the beeping of electronics created a kind of music. But even in this bustle, a calm surrounded him. He answered questions with his characteristic patience, explaining how the machine produced color and sound. The booth was draped in a simple cloth, and the Apple II logo, a stylized apple with a bite taken out, was painted on a sign overhead. Light poured in from high windows, illuminating dust motes that floated like slow confetti. People lined up to see the computer run a simple graphics program, a rainbow of bars and patterns that danced across the screen. They would lean in, their faces lit by the colors, and Wozniak would watch their expressions change from curiosity to wonder. It was the same wonder he felt when he first powered it on in the garage. The success of the Apple II was not an explosion but a steady, growing wave of orders from schools, small businesses, and families. The machine quietly found its way into classrooms where children learned to type and code. Wozniak sometimes visited these classrooms, sitting in a tiny chair and helping a young student debug a program. The classrooms were brightly lit, with windows overlooking playgrounds where swings moved lazily in the breeze. The walls were covered with art projects and the air smelled of crayons and glue. He would kneel beside a desk, his voice soft as he explained loops and variables. It was in these moments that the true purpose of his work became clear. He had not built a machine for fame or fortune. He had built it so that a child could make the screen light up with their own creation. The afternoon sun would stream through the windows, and the computer's green or amber screen added a gentle glow. The sound of children laughing outside mixed with the quiet tapping of keys. Wozniak would leave these visits feeling a deep, quiet joy, carrying it with him like a warm stone in his pocket. Back at Apple, the company was growing, moving out of the garage and into larger offices. Wozniak watched the transformation with a kind of distant fondness. The new offices had long hallways and conference rooms with whiteboards covered in diagrams. The light was the cool white of fluorescent tubes, different from the warm bulb in the garage. Yet he still found corners where he could work alone, a bench in a lab or a desk by a window. He would pull out a notebook and sketch ideas for the next thing, always playing, always exploring. The trees outside the window were young and slender, their leaves turning gold in the autumn. He could see the Santa Cruz Mountains in the distance, purple and hazy under the afternoon sun. The pace of business was quickening around him, but he remained in his own time, a calm center in a spinning world. He knew that the Apple II was his masterpiece, and he was content to let it go out into the world, to be used and loved by millions. The quiet engineer who had once built a blue box for fun had, without ever raising his voice, changed everything. As the years passed, Apple Computer grew into a large and powerful company. The gentle humming of the garage was replaced by the steady rhythm of an assembly line. New buildings rose in Cupertino, modern structures of glass and steel that reflected the California sky. Wozniak still came to work, but the atmosphere had changed. He had never cared for meetings or management. He preferred to be among the engineers, talking about chips and code. He would walk through the parking lot in the morning, the asphalt already shimmering with heat, and look up at the building that bore the name of his creation. The lobbies were filled with plants and modern furniture, and the walls displayed framed magazine covers featuring the Apple II. He felt a quiet pride, but also a growing sense of distance. The company was becoming a different kind of place, one where business decisions often overshadowed the simple joy of making things. He would stand by a window and watch the cars on the freeway, thinking about the road not taken. Then, in February of 1981, something happened that changed everything. Wozniak was piloting his small single-engine plane during takeoff from a Santa Cruz airport. The plane, a Beechcraft Bonanza, lifted into the bright California sky. He loved flying, loved the feeling of soaring above the patchwork of fields and orchards. But this time, the ascent ended abruptly. The plane stalled and crashed. Wozniak was rushed to the hospital with severe head injuries. His memory was shattered, and he could not remember the crash, nor much of his life. The next weeks were a fog of hospital rooms, the smell of antiseptic, the soft beeping of monitors. Sunlight came through Venetian blinds, casting long stripes on the white sheets. His family and friends kept vigil, speaking to him in low voices. Slowly, fragments of memory returned, like leaves settling after a storm. He recalled his name, his love of electronics, the face of his father. But the full picture took months to reassemble. It was a quiet battle, waged not with noise but with patience and rest. The rooms of the hospital were peaceful, with views of manicured gardens where fountains trickled and birds sang. After the accident, Wozniak decided to step back from his daily role at Apple. The experience had given him a new clarity. He realized that his life was not meant to be spent in boardrooms or in the rush of corporate deadlines. He still loved the company he had co-founded, but his heart was elsewhere. He married his girlfriend, Candace, in a simple ceremony, and they settled into a quieter life. He withdrew to a home in the mountains, a place surrounded by pine trees and the sound of wind. The house was of redwood and glass, with a deck that looked out over a forested valley. In the mornings, mist would rise among the trees, and he would sit with a cup of tea, watching the light gradually fill the canyon. He began to think about all the other things he wanted to do, things that had nothing to do with computers. He wanted to teach, to help children discover the magic he had found. He wanted to organize concerts and festivals, to bring people together through music. Most of all, he wanted to live simply, to enjoy the small moments that a busy life often obscured. One of his first projects after Apple was to organize a music festival. He called it the U.S. Festival, and it was held in 1982 and 1983 in the wide, open spaces of Glen Helen Regional Park in San Bernardino. The site was a vast green basin surrounded by gentle hills, and a large stage was built at the center. Wozniak poured millions of his own dollars into the event, not as an investment, but as a gift. The mornings of the festival began with the quiet setup, crews on the grass checking equipment, the sun rising over the hills and painting the landscape in soft pinks. As the day progressed, people arrived by the thousands, spreading blankets on the lawn and sharing food. The music filled the air, not loudly from a distance, but as a pleasant background to the collective joy. Wozniak could often be seen wandering through the crowd, a gentle smile on his face, unrecognized by most. He wore a simple t-shirt and shorts, and he took pictures with a small camera. The sky was a deep, endless blue, and by evening the stage lights would compete with the stars. It was his way of saying thank you to a world that had given him so much, a celebration of creativity and community. The festival lost money, but he never regretted it. For him, value was not measured in dollars, but in the shared experience of a beautiful day. In the years that followed, Wozniak found his greatest joy in teaching. He returned to the school district of his childhood and began working with young students in Los Gatos. The classroom was a small, cheerful room with posters on the walls and computers on every desk. He did not teach as a distant celebrity, but as a gentle guide, kneeling beside a student to show them how to write a simple program. The children called him Mr. Woz, and they loved him for his kindness. The light in the classroom was always soft, filtered through white curtains that billowed slightly in the breeze. He would show the students how to make a turtle move across the screen in Logo, and the children would gasp with delight. In winter, rain would streak the windows, and they would gather around a space heater, its orange glow warming their hands. He taught for many years, never seeking publicity. For him, the greatest reward was seeing a child's eyes light up when they understood something new. It was a quiet, hidden life, full of small, meaningful moments. He would leave the school in the afternoon, the sound of children's voices fading behind him, and drive home along roads lined with redwoods, the car following the curves of the mountain, surrounded by the deep peace of the forest. After the U.S. festival and his early teaching years, Wozniak's life took on a rhythm that felt natural and unhurried. He moved through the world not as a famous inventor, but as a quiet participant in everyday wonders. He could be seen driving his car along the coastal highways of California, the Pacific Ocean a vast blue companion on his left. The road curved gently, and cypress trees stood like guardians on the cliffs. Inside the car, he would listen to classic rock on the radio or to the sound of his own thoughts. He often traveled from his home to the school where he taught, but he also took longer journeys, sometimes to technology conferences where he would give talks. These talks were never lectures, they were more like stories shared among old friends. He would stand at a podium, his hair now graying, his voice still soft, and talk about the joy of engineering, the love of pranks, and the importance of kindness. The auditoriums would be large, but the stage light was warm, isolating him in a gentle glow. He never used notes, he simply spoke from the heart while the audience listened in rapt silence. His home life was a quiet sanctuary. He and Candace lived in a house that was part cabin, part modern retreat, nestled among trees in the Santa Cruz Mountains. The property was surrounded by ferns and redwoods, and a creek ran along the bottom of the hill. In the mornings, Wozniak would often brew coffee and sit on the deck, watching deer step delicately through the mist. He had a workshop, of course, a large space filled with oscilloscopes, soldering stations, and bins of components. But he also had a music room, with a grand piano and several guitars. He loved to play, not for performance, but for the sheer pleasure of it. The notes would blend with the sound of the wind through the trees. Afternoons were for tinkering with new electronics or for reading science fiction novels in a hammock strung between two trees. The sunlight, dappled by leaves, would make shifting patterns on the pages. He was a man who had found a deep and lasting peace, a peace that did not depend on the size of his bank account or the fame of his name. Teaching, however, remained his most cherished activity. He would arrive at the Los Gatos Elementary School early, parking his Prius in a spot near the gate. The schoolyard was quiet then, the jungle gyms and swings waiting for the children. The building was a low, friendly structure with murals painted by students on the walls. In his classroom, he had arranged the computers in a circle so that he could move from one to the next, always available. He taught the children not just code but also ethics and humor. He told them stories of his own pranks, and he encouraged them to find clever, harmless ways to surprise their parents. The room was always filled with the sound of gentle clicking and the occasional delighted laugh. When a child solved a problem, he would reach over and gently pat their shoulder. The light through the windows changed with the seasons, golden in September, pale in January, bright in May. He taught the same way regardless, with patience and warmth. At lunchtime, he would sit with the teachers in a sunlit staff room, eating a sandwich and discussing nothing more pressing than the upcoming school play. He was not a legend in that room. He was simply a colleague, and that was how he wanted it. As the years passed, Wozniak found other outlets for his generosity. He donated to children's hospitals, to science museums, and to community programs. But his philanthropy was never announced with trumpets. It was quiet, often anonymous. He helped design lesson plans that made technology accessible to young girls and boys from all backgrounds. He funded the construction of a planetarium in a town that needed one, and he went to its opening on a clear autumn night. The dome was lit from within, a soft halo against the dark hills. Inside, children tilted their heads back and watched stars projected onto the ceiling, their whispers of wonder filling the space. Wozniak sat among them, looking up as well. The simulation of the Milky Way was so vivid it felt almost real. That night, the real stars outside were just as brilliant, and he stood in the parking lot for a long time, his breath misting in the cold air, thinking about the vastness of the universe and the small, meaningful part he had been allowed to play. He drove home along the mountain roads, the headlights sweeping the curve of the forest, and he felt a simple, quiet happiness. In the public eye, he made occasional appearances. He danced on a television show, his movements clumsy but joyful, and the audience cheered for the sheer authenticity of it. He partnered with other tech pioneers on education initiatives. But he never sought the spotlight for long. Each public moment was followed by a retreat back to the woods and the classroom. The media sometimes called him a recluse, but that was wrong. He was not hiding, he was simply living. His life was full of friends, of family, of students. The phone in his house rang often, and he answered it gladly, speaking with anyone who needed help with a circuit or a piece of advice. His voice on the phone was the same as ever, calm and unhurried. If you closed your eyes, you could still hear the boy in Sunnyvale who had built a crystal radio and heard magic. Nothing had changed at the core. The world had spun forward, the internet had been born, smartphones were everywhere, but Steve Wozniak remained in his own time zone, one measured by the speed of a good conversation and the slow fading of a sunset. Today, his legacy is not just the machines he built, but the spirit in which he built them. The Apple II has long since been retired to museum exhibits, its beige case sitting under glass, a card describing its significance. Visitors at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View often pause before it. The gallery is quiet, with soft lighting that falls on the artifacts. They see the simple, elegant board, the handwritten labels, and they sense something that is harder to quantify, the presence of a creator who cared more about the gift than the reward. Wozniak himself might walk through that gallery unrecognized, an older man in a t-shirt and cap, smiling at the display without a trace of ego. Outside the museum, the boulevard is lined with tech companies, their glass towers gleaming. But the spirit of the garage, the spirit of the Homebrew Club, the spirit of a man who thought that computers should make people's lives better, has not disappeared. It lives in the open source movement, in STEM classrooms, in every child who learns to code and feels the thrill of making a machine do something new. It lives in the quiet, peaceful joy of creating something just because you can. The story of Steve Wozniak comes to a close not with a sudden stop, but with a gentle evening, the kind that falls slowly over the Santa Clara Valley. The highways that once carried him to work now hum with the distant sound of traffic, a sound that is less a noise than a lullaby. The orchards that he knew as a child are mostly gone, replaced by campuses and research parks, but here and there an apricot tree still stands, its branches heavy with fruit in summer. The house on Chris Drive is still there, a quiet landmark visited by tourists who stand respectfully at the curb and imagine the garage door opening, the smell of solder drifting out. The magnolia tree is larger now, its trunk thick, its flowers lighting up the spring with their cream-colored cups. The light in this part of the world is particular, soft and golden, known to painters and photographers. It filters through the eucalyptus and falls on the pavement in long, warm pools. It is the light of a California evening, the same light that shone on a boy building his first radio, the same light that fell on a garage where the future was being assembled, one chip at a time. And in that light, there is a continuity, a peace that endures. Imagine walking down that quiet street at dusk. The air is cool and carries the scent of jasmine. The houses are a mix of original ranch styles and newer rebuilds, but the rhythm of the neighborhood remains unhurried. A bicycle is left on a front lawn. A cat sits on a porch railing, watching the world with half-closed eyes. The sky above the Santa Cruz Mountains is a gradient of orange, pink, and the first deep blue. A star appears, then another. Inside one of these houses, a child might be sitting before a glowing screen, typing a simple command and watching a shape move. The shape is drawn by code that traces its lineage back to a man who once dreamed of making a computer that anyone could use. That man, now older and content, might be walking that same street, hands in his pockets, smiling at the memories. He is not a ghost of the past. He is very much alive, still curious, still kind. But in this peaceful image, time blends together, and we can see all the moments at once: the student, the tinkerer, the young engineer, the pilot, the teacher. They're all the same gentle soul, moving through the world with quiet wonder. The legacy of Wozniak's work is woven into the fabric of daily life. The device on your desk, the phone in your pocket, they all contain DNA from that first Apple II. But his deeper legacy is the reminder that innovation does not require noise. It can happen in a classroom where rain taps on the window, in a garage lit by a single bulb, in the stillness of a night spent drawing schematics. The best ideas come not from frantic effort but from a calm, open mind. Wozniak showed that you could change the world without losing your gentleness. He gave away pieces of his fortune and his time, but he never gave away his peace. His story is a bedtime story, not because it is dull, but because it is suffused with the kind of light that lets you rest. It is a story that tells us that, even in a world of constant noise, there can be pockets of profound stillness. And from those pockets, remarkable things can grow. Picture now the computer museum at night, when the last visitor has gone home. The galleries are dark, the only light coming from small, carefully placed spotlights that illuminate the artifacts. The Apple II sits in its case, its screen dark. The room is utterly silent, save for the faint hum of the climate control system. Outside, the parking lot is empty and the moon hangs low over the hills. The building is locked, safe, dreaming of the history it holds. This is the museum that holds not just machines but stories, the story of a small group of hobbyists who built the future in their spare time, the story of an engineer who wanted to share his work with the world for free, the story of a teacher who found more joy in a child's success than in any product launch. These stories are fragile things, like the filament in an old vacuum tube, glowing softly. They need to be told gently, without hurry, so that they can be absorbed into the quiet part of the mind. In the heart of Silicon Valley, there is a small park that few people know about. It sits behind a community center, and it has a bench dedicated to Wozniak. The plaque is modest, just his name and the words engineer, teacher, friend. Around the bench, lavender grows and bees move lazily from flower to flower. The view is of an open field where children sometimes fly kites. On a Sunday afternoon, you might find an old man sitting there alone, watching the kites dip and soar. He does not look like a billionaire or a legend. He looks like a grandfather, someone who has lived a good life and still finds joy in the simple things. This is the true end of the story, a scene of quiet contentment. The wind moves through the grass, the kites tug at their strings, and the sun, still warm, begins its final descent toward the coastal range. The man on the bench closes his eyes for a moment, feeling the breeze on his face. He remembers the hum of his first crystal radio, the thrill of his first flight, the laughter of his students. All of it is still there inside him, a quiet symphony that will outlast any piece of hardware. And so, as we prepare for sleep, we can hold this image of Steve Wozniak in our minds, not as a symbol of ambition or competition, but as the gentle architect who built his bridges and then sat down to watch the world cross them. His life teaches us that you do not have to be loud to be heard, that you do not have to be hard to be strong. The computer revolution was not only a series of logical leaps, it was also a work of patience and love. And love is a quiet thing. It works in the early hours before dawn, in the soft glow of a desk lamp, in the space between two friends sharing a soda in a garage. It works in a classroom full of children who believe they can do anything because a kind man showed them how. As you drift off, let the images come. The apricot trees, the magnolia blossoms, the green circuit board, the beige plastic case, the colorful screen, the misty redwood forest, the wide blue sky over the festival field, the silent museum, the park bench. Let them settle in your mind like a gentle rain, and may your dreams be filled with the same quiet wonder that filled the life of Steve Wozniak. Good night.